Elon Musk says 1 million people could be living on Mars by 2050. But the same planet could kill an unprotected human in less than 60 seconds through at least 5 different lethal mechanisms, all happening at once. Today, you'll discover what science really says about life on Mars, not the optimistic vision of science fiction, and not the promises of space companies, but the reality of surviving there day by day, hour by hour, and breath by breath. Now, let's begin. Ask most people what they think the hardest part of living on Mars would be, and you get the same answers every time. The loneliness, the distance from family, the monotony of eating the same food in the same room for years on end. These are the challenges that come up in interviews, in documentary panels, in the comment sections beneath every SpaceX launch video, and on the surface, they sound manageable, difficult, yes, but human. The kind of hardship that grit and community and a strong sense of purpose might actually overcome. That assumption is wrong, not partially wrong, completely wrong, because it skips past the first problem entirely, the one that kills you, before the loneliness even has time to register. Mars does not destroy you with a dramatic catastrophe. No explosion, no single catastrophic system failure with warning lights and a countdown clock. Mars kills you with something far more ordinary and far more absolute. It kills you with physics, basic, foundational, textbook physics that no amount of willpower, fitness, or courage has any power over whatsoever. Here is the number that changes everything. The atmospheric pressure on the surface of Mars is approximately 0.6% of what you experience at sea level on Earth, not 6%. 0.6. To put that in terms, you can feel rather than just read Earth's atmospheric pressure at sea level sits at roughly 101 kilopascals. On the Martian surface, that number collapses to about 0.6 kilopascals. That is not thin air. That is not the kind of altitude sickness you might feel hiking above 10,000 feet in Colorado. That is something in an entirely different category of danger. In aerospace medicine, there is a threshold called the Armstrong limit. It sits at roughly 63,000 feet above sea level on Earth. At that altitude, atmospheric pressure drops so low that water boils at 37 degrees Celsius, the temperature of the human body, not because of heat, because of the absence of pressure. Pressure is what keeps liquid water stable inside your body at normal temperatures. Remove the pressure, and the physics changes. The water in your tissues does not wait for permission. It simply changes state. The surface of Mars sits far beyond the Armstrong limit. If you stepped onto Martian ground without a fully pressurized suit, the moisture lining your lungs would begin to vaporize within seconds. The fluid in your eyes, the saliva in your mouth, not boiling in the way a pot of water boils on a stove, but transitioning to gas because the environment around them no longer contains enough pressure to hold them in liquid form. Your lungs would be unable to function. Consciousness would fade in approximately 15 seconds. Your heart would stop in under 2 minutes, not from oxygen deprivation alone, from the fundamental physics of what happens to liquid in a near-vacuum environment. This is not theoretical. It is not a worst-case scenario built on speculation. It is confirmed aerospace physiology, established through decades of altitude chamber research and pressure threshold testing conducted by NASA and aerospace medicine institutions around the world. Now add what little atmosphere Mars actually has. Roughly 96% of it is carbon dioxide. Nitrogen accounts for about 2.6%. Argon makes up approximately 1.6%. Oxygen exists as a trace gas at around 0.16%. On Earth, oxygen comprises about 21% of the atmosphere. On Mars, oxygen is essentially absent. But here's the detail that compounds the horror, even if somehow the pressure were survivable. Every breath you attempted to take would be a breath of nearly pure carbon dioxide. At concentrations above 5%, carbon dioxide causes rapid loss of consciousness. The Martian atmosphere is 96% carbon dioxide. You would not suffocate slowly. You would lose consciousness before your brain had time to register what was happening. Two separate mechanisms, both fatal, both activating simultaneously within seconds of unprotected exposure. The pressure kills the liquid state of your body fluids. The atmosphere poisons every breath before the pressure even finishes the job. This is what the science actually says about the very first physical reality of Mars. Not the loneliness, not the food, not the distance. The moment you consider stepping outside without complete mechanical protection, you are not facing a challenge. You are facing an execution carried out by the laws of thermodynamics. Mars is not a harsh environment. It is a lethal one. There is a difference, and it matters enormously. Harsh environments test people. They demand endurance and adaptation. Lethal environments simply end biological function. The Martian surface belongs entirely in the second category. No acclimatization changes this. No training protocol addresses it. No degree of physical conditioning makes the Armstrong limit negotiable. That is the first layer, the one you can measure, quantify, and, at least in principle, engineer around with the right equipment. It announces itself immediately. It does not hide, because the greatest danger on Mars is not the one that announces itself at all. Because the greatest danger on Mars is not something you can see, hear, or feel. It is passing through you right now if you are standing on that surface, and you will not know until it is already too late. Think about the last time radiation crossed your mind. Probably in a hospital waiting room, filling out a form asking how many X-rays you have had in the past year. Maybe a brief thought during a news story about a nuclear plant somewhere far away. For most Americans, radiation is a background concern, at most something managed by professionals in lead-lined rooms, something measured and monitored and kept safely behind institutional walls. It is not a feature of daily life. It is not something you think about while drinking your morning coffee or walking to your car. That comfortable distance from radiation is not a coincidence. It is the result of two planetary systems working in your favor every second of every day, so silently and so completely that you have never once had to think about them. The first is Earth's magnetosphere, generated by the churning liquid iron deep inside our planet's core. This magnetic field extends tens of thousands of kilometers into space in every direction, creating an invisible deflection barrier around the entire planet. Charged particles streaming outward from the sun and inward from deep space slam into this magnetic envelope and get redirected, sent arcing away from Earth's surface along field lines that guide them toward the poles, rather than down toward you. The second layer is the atmosphere itself, a column of gas roughly 100 kilometers deep that absorbs and scatters whatever high-energy radiation manages to navigate past the magnetic field. Together, these two systems reduce the radiation reaching Earth's surface to an average background dose of approximately 3.1 millisieverts per year for the typical American. Your body handles this effortlessly. Your DNA repair mechanisms treat it as routine. It is, from a biological standpoint, trivial. Mars has neither of these systems, not in weakened form, not partially, effectively, not at all. Approximately 4 billion years ago, Mars lost its global magnetic field. The planet's interior cooled faster than Earth's. The dynamo process that generates a planetary magnetic shield shut down, and the protection it provided disappeared with it. What remains are scattered patches of residual magnetism frozen into ancient southern crust, weak, localized, and offering no meaningful protection to anything or anyone on the surface. For all practical purposes, Mars is magnetically naked. It faces the full particle environment of interplanetary space with nothing standing between its surface and the stream of radiation pouring in from every direction. The atmosphere that remains that same thin veil of carbon dioxide we established is already lethal to breathe. Provides almost no shielding against the most dangerous forms of space radiation. High-energy particles pass through it as though it barely exists. The result of these two absent shields shows up in the data with brutal clarity. The radiation assessment detector aboard NASA's Curiosity rover has been measuring surface radiation on Mars continuously since 2012. The numbers it has returned confirm that the annual radiation dose on the Martian surface reaches approximately 240 to 300 millisieverts per year from galactic cosmic rays alone, roughly 80 to 100 times the natural background dose an American receives annually on Earth. 80 to 100 times. Every single year, with no season where it diminishes, no time of day when it pauses, no location on the planet's surface where it relents. There are two distinct threats embedded in that number, and they operate very differently from each other. The first is galactic cosmic rays. These are not rays in the everyday sense of the word. They are particles, primarily protons, but also heavier atomic nuclei stripped entirely of their electrons, accelerated to extraordinary velocities by supernova explosions and other violent events scattered across the galaxy. Among the most dangerous are what physicists call HZ, E particles, high charge, high energy nuclei of elements like iron, silicon, and carbon, traveling at meaningful fractions of the speed of light. When one of these particles passes through biological tissue, it does not simply ionize a few molecules the way a dental X-ray does. It carves a dense corridor of molecular destruction through every cell along its path, shattering chemical bonds, fragmenting chromosomes, leaving a trail of damage that the body's repair mechanisms struggle to address correctly. Misrepaired DNA does not disappear. It becomes the origin point of cancer. And galactic cosmic rays are constant. They arrive every second of every day, year after year, with no variation and no off switch. The second threat is solar particle events. Sudden, intense eruptions of energetic protons ejected from the sun during solar flares and coronal mass ejections. Unlike the steady background of cosmic rays, these events are episodic. But during a major event, the dose delivered can reach hundreds of millisieverts within a matter of hours. That is enough to cause acute radiation syndrome nausea, vomiting, catastrophic immune suppression, and, in severe cases, death within days or weeks. On Earth, the magnetosphere deflects the vast majority of this energy before it reaches the upper atmosphere. NASA's MAVEN orbiter has confirmed that on Mars, solar particle events strip material directly from the planet's atmosphere, and the surface receives the full force of the energetic proton flux during major solar storms. Now consider what these numbers mean against NASA's own safety standards. In 2022, NASA standardized a career radiation limit for all astronauts at 600 millisieverts, regardless of age or sex, based on acceptable cancer risk thresholds on the Martian surface, receiving approximately 240 to 300 millisieverts per year from galactic cosmic rays alone. A person reaches that career limit in roughly 2 to 2.5 years. That calculation does not include the additional dose accumulated during the 6 to 9 month transit from Earth to Mars through unshielded interplanetary space, where there is no planetary atmosphere providing even minimal protection. A 2013 study published in PLOS One, using NASA's own risk projection models, estimated that radiation-induced mortality risk on a Mars mission could exceed 5%, with upper confidence intervals approaching 10%. 5 to 10% of everyone who goes. Not from a crash, not from equipment failure, from the ambient environment of a planet that lost its magnetic shield 4 billion years ago and has been bathed in unfiltered cosmic radiation ever since. But there is a detail that almost no one discusses when the conversation turns to radiation shielding on Mars, and it changes the problem in a way that makes the solution far more complicated than simply building thicker walls. Because when cosmic radiation strikes matter, it does not simply stop. It creates something new, something that in certain configurations is more dangerous than the original particle that produced it. The instinct makes complete sense. If radiation is pouring down from above, go underground. Put rock between yourself and the sky. The deeper you go, the more mass stands between your body and the particle stream hammering the surface. It is the same logic that drove Cold War civil defense planners to build fallout shelters beneath American cities. The logic of depth as protection, of mass as medicine. Get low enough, stay buried long enough, and the rock above you does the work your absent magnetic field cannot. It is a reasonable instinct. On Mars, it is also dangerously incomplete. A 2022 study published in the Journal of Geophysical Research modeled radiation dose as a function of depth beneath the Martian surface with a level of precision that had not previously been achieved. The researchers mapped what a human body would actually absorb at various depths from the exposed surface down through several meters of regolith. What they found overturns the intuitive picture entirely. The effective radiation dose does not decrease steadily as you descend below the surface. It peaks. It reaches its maximum not on the open surface, not in the sky above, but at approximately 30 centimeters below the ground. A person lying under a thin blanket of Martian dirt would absorb a higher radiation dose than a person standing in the open air above them. To understand why, you have to understand what happens when a galactic cosmic ray particle strikes matter. It does not simply stop. It interacts with the atomic nuclei of whatever material it hits, in this case, the iron oxides, silicates, and mineral compounds that make up Martian regolith, and that interaction produces secondary particles, primarily neutrons. These secondary neutrons scatter outward from the collision point in every direction, including downward and sideways, radiating through the surrounding material in a diffuse cloud of secondary radiation. At 30 centimeters of depth, the geometry of this scattering creates a convergence zone where primary particles arriving from above and secondary neutrons scattering from every direction combine into a dose that exceeds what either source would deliver alone. The shallow underground is not a refuge. It is a trap. Beyond that 30-centimeter danger zone, the picture does improve but slowly, and with requirements that reframe the entire engineering challenge of Martian habitation. The same study found that reducing annual exposure below 100 millisieverts, the threshold that most occupational radiation protection frameworks consider acceptable for long-term workers, requires a continuous regolith shield between 1 meter and 1.6 meters thick over the entire habitat structure. Not 1 meter at the thickest point, 1 to 1.6 meters uniformly, across every surface exposed to the sky, to approach something closer to Earth's natural background radiation levels. The required depth increases to 3 meters or more. Think about what that actually means in practical terms. A habitat built on the Martian surface and then buried under 1 to 3 meters of crushed rock is not a building with a dirt roof. It is a structure designed from the foundation up to support hundreds or thousands of metric tons of overlying material that must be excavated, transported, and placed by heavy autonomous machinery before any human crew arrives. On a planet where every piece of equipment was shipped from Earth and cannot be replaced quickly if it breaks. This is not an afternoon project. It is a major industrial preparation campaign measured in months or years of robotic work. The alternative is to build inside geological features that already provide the necessary mass. Orbital reconnaissance has identified lava tubes on Mars' ancient underground tunnels, carved by volcanic flows billions of years ago, now hollow beneath the surface. Some of these structures, based on imaging data from Mars orbiters, may span diameters of hundreds of meters, large enough to contain entire pressurized settlements beneath a natural rock ceiling that provides the shielding mass no surface construction could easily replicate. Multiple research groups and space agencies have proposed lava tubes as primary candidates for early Martian settlements, precisely because of this shielding advantage. But lava tubes are not ready-made habitats waiting to be occupied. Their interiors have never been directly examined. The structural integrity of their ceilings, after 4 billion years of thermal cycling, seismic activity, and meteorite impacts across the Martian surface, is unknown. Accessing them may require navigating steep terrain or constructing entry tunnels through unstable regolith. Building pressurized habitats inside them demands all the same engineering as surface construction. Plus, the additional complications of working inside an enclosed underground environment with no natural light, limited access points, and the ever-present risk that a partial ceiling collapse far more catastrophic in a confined underground space than any failure mode a surface structure would face could compromise everything inside. Either path leads to the same destination. The Mars habitat that emerges from any serious radiation analysis is not a gleaming dome with panoramic windows overlooking rust-colored plains at sunset. That image reproduced endlessly in mission animations, on company websites, in science fiction. Concept art is radiologically indefensible. Glass transmits galactic cosmic rays without meaningful attenuation. A large transparent surface in a Martian habitat is not a window. It is a radiation inlet. Every hour spent in an unshielded or lightly shielded space is an hour of absorbed dose accumulating silently in tissue. Moving the occupant closer to lifetime exposure limits that, once exceeded, cannot be walked back. The realistic Mars habitat is underground, dark, cut off from the sky by meters of rock or compacted regolith. No natural light reaching the living quarters, no view of the horizon, no sunrise visible from any room where a person sleeps, eats, or works. The walls are not transparent, they are massive. The ceiling above is not architecture, it is ballistic shielding, measured in metric tons per square meter. This is what radiation physics demands, not what engineers prefer, not what mission planners find aesthetically appealing, not what promotional videos will ever show, but what the particle environment of an unshielded planet actually requires to keep a human body alive for years rather than months, and when you have solved the radiation problem by burying yourself under the surface of Mars. What waits for you down there is something that follows you in regardless of how thick the walls are, regardless of how carefully you seal every entrance, regardless of how many filtration systems you run, and when you have solved the radiation by living underground. What waits for you there is something far more insidious. A dust that science describes as a toxic cocktail capable of quietly destroying your body from the inside, and it is everywhere. Dust is one of those words that carries almost no weight in everyday American life. It is the thin gray film on the bookshelf you keep meaning to wipe down. It is the reason you run the ceiling fan before guests arrive. It is a Saturday morning inconvenience. Something a damp cloth and 10 minutes resolves completely. The word itself implies something minor, something passive, something that sits quietly and waits to be cleaned up. Martian dust is none of those things. The word is the same. The substance is categorically different. And the gap between what the word implies and what the science confirms is wide enough to kill you slowly, invisibly, and without a single moment that feels like a crisis until the damage is already permanent. Start with the physical dimension of the particles themselves. Martian dust averages approximately 3 micrometers in diameter. 3 micrometers is roughly 4% of the width of a single human hair. At that scale, these particles enter a classification that pulmonary medicine takes very seriously: respirable dust. This means they are small enough to bypass the body's primary filtration systems entirely. The nasal passages, the cilia lining the upper airways, the bronchial mucus layers that trap larger particles. None of these defenses work effectively against particles this fine. 3 micrometer particles travel past all of it, deep into the lungs, all the way to the alveoli, the tiny air sacs where oxygen crosses into the bloodstream. Once there, the body cannot clear them efficiently. They lodge in the alveolar tissue and remain, not for days, permanently, in a coal mine in West Virginia or a silica quarry in Arizona. This kind of particle exposure is managed with respirators, exposure limits, regular medical screening, and mandatory rotation away from hazardous environments. On Mars, the hazardous environment is the entire planet. There is no rotating away from it. Now consider what those permanently lodged particles are actually made of. The composition of Martian dust is not uniform fine grit. It is a mixture of compounds, each bringing its own distinct mechanism of harm, all of them operating simultaneously in the same tissue. Silica is present in significant quantities. On Earth, chronic inhalation of crystalline silica causes silicosis, a progressive, irreversible fibrosis of the lung in which scar tissue gradually replaces functional respiratory tissue. The scarring does not heal. It does not stabilize with treatment. It accumulates. Lung capacity declines steadily over years, and the condition is well documented in miners, construction workers, and industrial laborers who were exposed decades before the risks were fully understood. The silica in Martian dust carries exactly the same mechanism into exactly the same tissue. Perchlorate salts compound the problem in a different direction entirely. Perchlorate is a chlorine-oxygen compound found in Martian regolith at concentrations between 0.5 and 1% by weight. On Earth, the Environmental Protection Agency treats perchlorate contamination in drinking water at levels of just a few parts per billion as a regulatory emergency requiring immediate remediation. The regolith of Mars carries it at concentrations millions of times higher than that threshold. When perchlorate-laden dust is inhaled, it dissolves in the moist tissue lining the lungs and enters the bloodstream, directly bypassing the digestive system, bypassing the liver's filtering capacity, entering circulation without any intermediate step. From the blood, it interferes with the thyroid gland's ability to absorb iodine, disrupting hormonal regulation in ways that cascade through metabolism, cognition, and cardiovascular function. Chronic perchlorate exposure at sufficient levels is associated with aplastic anemia, a condition in which the bone marrow progressively fails to produce adequate red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. The immune system weakens. Oxygen carrying capacity of the blood declines. The body begins losing its ability to repair itself at the most fundamental cellular level. Then there is the iron oxide, the nanoscale iron oxide particles that give Mars its characteristic red color, carry a property that makes the dust problem structurally unsolvable by any conventional cleaning method. They are electrostatically charged. This is not a minor surface characteristic. At the molecular level, electrostatically charged particles of this size bond to fabric, metal, polymer, and biological surfaces with an adhesive force that brushing, shaking, vacuuming, and air blasting cannot fully overcome. Laboratory simulations of Martian dust adhesion have confirmed that these particles cling to suit materials and equipment surfaces in ways that make complete decontamination effectively impossible with any cleaning protocol currently developed. A 2025 study published in GeoHealth, led by researchers at the University of Colorado and the University of Southern California, compiled the full toxicological profile of Martian dust exposure and reached a conclusion that the research community had been approaching for years. The study characterized respiratory and systemic health risks from Martian dust as among the most serious and most underappreciated hazards of living on Mars. Not a secondary concern, not a manageable nuisance to be addressed by better suit design, one of the primary threats to human survival on the planet's surface. The operational reality confirms why. Every time an airlock cycles, every time a crew member returns from a surface excursion and re-enters the habitat, dust enters with them. It coats the exterior of suits. It clings to glove surfaces and boot soles and helmet seals. No matter how rigorous the decontamination protocol, particles 3 micrometers in diameter carrying electrostatic charge do not release from surfaces on command. Over weeks and months of regular surface operations, the concentration of Martian dust inside the habitat rises. Filters capture some of it, not all of it, never all of it. And there is no safe long-term exposure threshold for a substance that is simultaneously a respiratory fibrosis agent, a hormonal disruptor, a bone marrow toxin, and a carcinogen. On Earth, a worker diagnosed with early silicosis is removed from the exposure environment immediately. The exposure stops. The disease progresses more slowly without continued input. On Mars, the exposure environment is the habitat itself, the only place you can exist. There is nowhere to be removed to. The dust is the air. The air is where you live. The contamination is permanent and cumulative for as long as you remain on the planet. And the dust is only one of the silent enemies accumulating inside the walls of a Mars habitat. Because even the air you breathe, every single molecule of it, must be manufactured from scratch by a machine that, if it stops for just 48 hours, leaves everyone inside with no viable path to survival. You have taken approximately 20,000 breaths today. You did not think about a single one of them. Not one. Your diaphragm contracted. Your chest expanded. Air moved in. Carbon dioxide moved out. And your brain received the oxygen it needed to process every thought, every sensation, every word you have read in this story. All of it happened automatically, continuously, without a moment of conscious effort or the faintest awareness that anything was occurring at all. This is so deeply embedded in human experience that it does not register as a gift. It registers as nothing. Oxygen is simply there in the room, in the yard, outside the window, in every direction you could possibly turn. It has been there every moment of your life. It will be there when you wake up tomorrow. The idea that it might not be is so far outside the architecture of normal human concern that most people have never spent a single second thinking about it. On Mars, that assumption evaporates on day one, and what replaces it is something far more unsettling than the absence of air. What replaces it is arithmetic. The Martian atmosphere contains approximately 0.16% oxygen. That number is not a foundation to build on. It is not a starting point that engineering can amplify through clever filtration. You cannot concentrate Martian atmospheric oxygen the way you might purify contaminated water. The quantity is simply too small, and the dominant gas surrounding it, 96% carbon dioxide, is immediately toxic at the concentrations present. To obtain breathable oxygen on Mars, you must manufacture it. You must break molecular bonds and liberate oxygen atoms from the compounds that contain them. There is no other option. NASA tested one pathway with the MOXIE instrument, the Mars Oxygen In Situ Resource Utilization Experiment, carried aboard the Perseverance rover. MOXIE used solid oxide electrolysis to split carbon dioxide molecules into carbon monoxide and oxygen, collecting the oxygen for measurement and venting the carbon monoxide. During its test cycles on the Martian surface, MOXIE produced approximately 6 grams of oxygen per hour. That number represents a genuine technological achievement, the first demonstration of oxygen production from Martian atmosphere, conducted on another planet, proving the chemistry works under real conditions. It also reveals the scale of the problem with complete clarity. A resting adult human being consumes approximately 840 grams of oxygen per day. That works out to 35 grams per hour, just to keep one person alive while doing essentially nothing. A single MOXIE unit operating at its demonstrated output of 6 grams per hour meets approximately 17% of one person's resting oxygen requirement. Not 17% of a crew, 17% of one person. To sustain a crew of 4 at rest, not working, not exercising, not conducting any activity that elevates metabolic demand, requires a system producing more than 140 grams of oxygen per hour, running without interruption, every hour of every day, with zero tolerance for downtime. Scaling MOXIE's technology to that output is not a matter of multiplying one device by a larger number. MOXIE was a technology demonstrator the size of a car battery, designed to prove a concept. A full-scale oxygen production system, capable of sustaining human life, would require complete redesign, substantially greater power input, complex thermal management to handle the heat generated at scale, larger and heavier components that must survive launch loads and landing impact, and more intricate gas handling plumbing with more potential failure points in a system that cannot afford to fail. And oxygen generation is only half of the atmospheric equation. Producing enough oxygen to breathe is necessary. It is not sufficient, because a sealed habitat does not simply run low on oxygen over time. It simultaneously accumulates the carbon dioxide that 4 human bodies exhale continuously. 4 people in an enclosed space produce approximately 4 kilograms of carbon dioxide every single day through normal respiration alone. Carbon dioxide at concentrations above 1% causes headaches, reduced concentration, and measurable cognitive impairment. The judgment problems begin before the discomfort becomes obvious, which means the first symptom of a failing carbon dioxide scrubber is precisely the symptom least likely to be noticed by the people experiencing it. Above 5%, carbon dioxide causes loss of consciousness. The carbon dioxide removal system must run in parallel with oxygen generation continuously, with no operational gap that allows accumulation to build toward those thresholds. 2 systems, both essential, both must function without pause. Neither can be taken offline for maintenance without an immediate plan for what happens to the air quality during the interval. Consider the failure timeline with the precision it deserves. If the oxygen generation system stops functioning for 8 hours, oxygen concentration inside the habitat begins declining from its maintained level. After 24 hours of failure, carbon dioxide has accumulated to concentrations that impair cognitive function in every crew member. The people who need to diagnose and fix the failure. After 48 hours, the situation has crossed from engineering emergency into medical emergency. The crew is not thinking clearly. Their problem-solving capacity is compromised by the very atmosphere they are trying to repair. The margin between a functioning life support system and a medical crisis is measured in hours, not days. This is not the catastrophic scenario. This is the operational risk that exists every morning when the crew wakes up. Every day begins with a check of the atmospheric systems, because every day begins with the knowledge that those systems are the only reason everyone in the habitat is still alive. The oxygen generation unit is not background infrastructure, the way a furnace or a water heater is background infrastructure in an American home. It is the foreground of existence. It is the first thing checked and the last thing verified before sleep, because without it, nothing else matters for very long. Breathing on Mars is not a reflex. It is a manufacturing process. And like every manufacturing process, it depends on inputs, energy, equipment integrity, and the absence of failure in a chain where every link is load-bearing. But oxygen is only one leg of the survival tripod, and the second leg, water, is not just scarce. It contains a contradiction that cuts directly to the heart of every life support calculation on Mars. The same water you need to breathe, you also need to drink, to grow food. And those demands cannot all be met at the same time. There is water on Mars. This is not speculation or hopeful projection. Orbital radar instruments, surface rover measurements, and analysis of Martian meteorites have confirmed it with increasing confidence over decades of study. Water ice exists in the polar caps, visible from orbit. It exists in the shallow subsurface at high latitudes. Orbital data from NASA's Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter suggests buried ice deposits at mid-latitudes as well, in some locations beginning just centimeters beneath the surface. When people hear this, a reasonable conclusion follows almost automatically. The water problem is solved. Mars has water. Bring the equipment to get it, and the crew drinks. That conclusion is wrong, not because the water is not there, because getting it out, making it safe, and keeping enough of it in circulation to sustain human life is an industrial operation of staggering complexity, one that can fail at multiple points, consumes resources that are themselves critically limited, and cannot be paused even briefly without consequences that ripple immediately through every other survival system in the habitat. Begin with extraction. Subsurface water ice on Mars is not sitting in a convenient underground lake waiting to be pumped to the surface. It is frozen solid within regolith, the same loose, mineral-laden, perchlorate-saturated rock and dust that covers the entire planet. Accessing it requires excavation equipment, capable of cutting through frozen, compacted Martian soil at ambient temperatures that hover around -60 degrees Celsius. Machinery operating at those temperatures faces lubrication failures, material brittleness, and accelerated mechanical wear in every moving part. The excavated material then needs to be heated to melt the ice and separate water from the surrounding minerals, a process that consumes electrical power at a significant rate on a planet where power is already among the most constrained resources available. The water that emerges from this process is not clean. It carries dissolved perchlorates, sulfates, iron compounds, and other mineral contaminants that the Martian regolith has been accumulating for billions of years. This is where the filtration requirement becomes critical in a way that has no margin for compromise. Perchlorate in drinking water at concentrations measured in parts per billion billionths of a gram per liter triggers regulatory action under EPA standards on Earth. The water extracted from Martian regolith carries perchlorate at concentrations orders of magnitude above that threshold. Every liter produced from subsurface ice must be processed through filtration systems capable of reducing perchlorate contamination to genuinely safe levels before it touches a human digestive system. Even trace amounts consumed consistently over months will interfere with thyroid iodine absorption, disrupt hormonal regulation, and at sufficient cumulative doses contribute to the aplastic anemia risk already introduced by dust inhalation. 3 separate hazard pathways: dust inhalation, contaminated water, and perchlorate-laden food all converge on the same organ system. And the water filtration step is the one point where one of those pathways can be controlled. Every stage of this chain excavation, heating, primary filtration, secondary purification requires power, requires functional machinery, and requires maintenance. Any single stage failing does not pause water production. It stops it entirely until the failure is diagnosed and repaired using whatever tools and spare parts the crew has on hand. This is why the operational model for Mars water management does not center on mining. It centers on recycling, and the recycling target is not comfortable or modest. The International Space Station currently recovers approximately 90% of its water through a closed-loop system that captures moisture from cabin air humidity, processes urine through a series of filtration and distillation stages, and reclaims water from various other waste streams. 90% recovery is considered an engineering achievement in Earth orbit, where resupply missions arrive regularly, and the system can be supplemented when recycling falls short. On Mars, 90% is not the achievement. It is the floor. A Mars habitat would need to match or exceed that figure because the alternative replacing lost water through continuous subsurface mining is too energy-intensive, too mechanically demanding, and too vulnerable to equipment failure to serve as a primary supply strategy. The closed loop must be nearly perfect, sustained indefinitely, with no significant losses tolerated. What that means in practice is this. The water you drink on Mars today was almost certainly perspiration, exhaled breath moisture, or processed urine within the past several days. Your crewmate's sweat from yesterday's equipment maintenance is cycling through the reclamation system right now, moving toward the drinking water reservoir. The water vapor your own lungs exhaled this morning has been captured by the atmospheric humidity recovery system and is being processed alongside everyone else's biological output into the same supply you will draw from tomorrow. This is not a hypothetical or worst-case scenario. It is the designed operational state of any Mars water system that has any realistic chance of functioning long-term. The psychological weight of this is real, and the practical engineering weight is heavier. A water recycling system that processes biological waste at near-perfect efficiency is not a simple device. It is a network of membranes, distillation units, chemical treatment stages, sensors, and pumps that must all operate in coordination, continuously, in an environment where Martian dust is working its way into every mechanical interface and temperature cycling is stressing every seal and joint. The International Space Station has experienced repeated water system maintenance issues, mineral buildup in processing lines, biofouling in storage tanks, sensor malfunctions requiring crew intervention, and the ISS operates with real-time ground support and regular resupply of replacement components on Mars. Those maintenance issues must be resolved with whatever is in the spare parts inventory, without calling anyone, with a communication delay measured in tens of minutes per exchange. And then there is the contradiction that sits at the center of the entire water budget, the one that cannot be engineered away without trade-offs that cut directly into other survival systems. If the crew chooses to generate oxygen through water, electrolysis, splitting water molecules into hydrogen and oxygen using electrical current, every liter of water fed into the electrolysis system is a liter permanently removed from the drinking supply, the irrigation supply, and the hygiene supply until new water is produced or recovered. Breathing and drinking are not separate resource streams on Mars. They draw from the same reservoir. More water allocated to oxygen production means less water available for crops, less for personal hygiene that prevents infection in a confined space, less margin against recycling system inefficiency. This balance is not calculated once and set. It shifts every day based on crew activity levels, how hard everyone is working, and how much they are sweating, the current growth stage of crops and their irrigation requirements, the rate at which atmospheric pressure is leaking through imperfect seals, and the real-time efficiency of recycling systems that are aging and degrading with every passing week. Someone in the crew is managing this equation continuously. Adjust one variable, and 3 others move. It is not resource management. It is a daily negotiation with the physics of survival on a planet that provides none of its own answers. And if water is already this complicated, food, which must be grown, harvested, and processed on the most chemically hostile soil in the solar system, is a problem that no one in space science has yet dared to call solved. In 2015, a film called The Martian introduced an idea to tens of millions of people and made it feel not just plausible, but almost obvious. A stranded astronaut, alone on Mars, uses his botany expertise and whatever materials are on hand to grow potatoes in Martian soil, fertilized with human waste. The scene is clever, scientifically grounded enough to feel authentic, and deeply satisfying in the way that human ingenuity stories always are. It lodged itself in the cultural imagination as a kind of proof of concept. If you are smart enough, resourceful enough, determined enough, you can grow food on Mars. The planet becomes a farm. The problem becomes solvable. The actual chemistry of Martian soil makes that image not just optimistic, but dangerous. Not dangerous as in difficult to achieve, dangerous as in the food would poison the people eating it. Here is the specific number that changes everything. Martian regolith contains perchlorate salts at concentrations between 0.5 and 1% by weight. This is not a trace contaminant. It is not background noise in an otherwise usable growing medium. It is a significant chemical component of the soil itself, distributed throughout the regolith across the planet's surface and confirmed by multiple Mars landers and rovers over more than 2 decades of surface analysis. Plants are not passive recipients of whatever soil chemistry surrounds their roots. They are active accumulators. Root systems draw water and dissolved minerals from the surrounding medium and transport them upward through the plant's vascular tissue into stems, leaves, and fruit. Perchlorate dissolves readily in water. In perchlorate-contaminated soil, plants absorb it through their roots and concentrate it in their edible tissue. A person eating a plant grown in unprocessed Martian regolith would consume perchlorate at concentrations that dwarf any regulatory threshold ever established for human safety. The comparison puts this in concrete terms. The United States Environmental Protection Agency considers perchlorate in drinking water at concentrations above 15 parts per billion 15 billionths of a gram per liter a level requiring immediate regulatory action. Martian regolith carries perchlorate at concentrations between 0.5 and 1% by weight. Converting that to comparable units, The regolith concentration is roughly 30,000 to 60,000 times higher than the EPA's emergency threshold for water contamination. Any crop grown in unprocessed Martian dirt would be saturated with a compound that disrupts thyroid function, interferes with iodine uptake, and at chronic exposure levels contributes to aplastic anemia, the same bone marrow failure pathway introduced by dust inhalation and contaminated water. The food itself would become another vector, delivering the same toxin through a third route simultaneously. The engineering response to this problem exists. You can wash perchlorate out of regolith using water flushing the soil repeatedly until dissolved perchlorate concentrations drop to levels where plant uptake falls within manageable ranges. You can then supplement the washed regolith with nitrogen and phosphorus-based fertilizers to replace the nutrient profile that Martian dirt lacks entirely. You can inoculate it with carefully selected microbial communities to establish the nutrient cycling that makes terrestrial soil biologically productive. In principle, this process can produce a growing medium that supports plant life without poisoning whoever eats what grows in it. The cost of that process is paid in water. Washing perchlorate from regolith in sufficient quantities to support a settlement's food production requires flushing large volumes of water through large volumes of soil, producing perchlorate-laden wastewater that must then be processed through its own dedicated treatment chain before it can re-enter the habitat's water recycling loop. This water demand competes directly with drinking, oxygen generation, and every other claim on the habitat's most constrained resource. Every liter used to decontaminate growing medium is a liter temporarily removed from the survival budget of a crew that cannot afford shortfalls in any direction. The practical result of all these constraints is a food system that looks nothing like agriculture, as any American farmer or home gardener would recognize it. Crops would be grown in hydroponic or aeroponic systems, soil-free setups delivering nutrient solutions directly to root systems suspended in water, or misted with carefully calibrated mineral mixes under artificial lighting inside pressurized modules. The light comes from LED arrays tuned for photosynthetic efficiency, powered by the habitat's electrical system, operating on schedules optimized for crop yield rather than human comfort. The plants that make sense in this environment are selected purely on the basis of caloric density, growth speed, and spatial efficiency. Potatoes, soybeans, wheat, lettuce, a limited rotation of vegetables that produce reasonable yields in confined hydroponic bays without requiring the kind of space, water, or nutrient inputs that would make them resource prohibitive. Animal protein is effectively off the table. The resource arithmetic is unambiguous. Maintaining livestock, even small animals like chickens or fish in a sealed habitat, requires feed that must itself be grown, water that is already critically allocated, atmospheric load from respiration, and waste gases that adds to the carbon dioxide and humidity management burden, and physical space that a small pressurized structure cannot spare. The caloric return per unit of resource invested is dramatically lower for animal protein than for direct plant cultivation. A Mars settlement would eat a plant-based diet, not because of any philosophical preference, because the physics and chemistry of the environment leave no viable alternative. And then there is the risk that sits beneath all of this, the one that makes every calculation about food production on Mars feel less like agriculture planning and more like probability management on the edge of a cliff. A fungal outbreak in a hydroponic bay can move through a crop within days. A lighting system failure lasting 48 hours can stress or kill plants mid-growth cycle. A miscalculation in nutrient solution pH can trigger a deficiency cascade that damages an entire planting before the symptoms are visible enough to diagnose. A single contamination event in the water supply feeding the hydroponic system reintroduces perchlorate or microbial pathogens into the food chain through a pathway the crew thought they had controlled. Any of these scenarios can eliminate days, weeks, or months of accumulated food production in a single event. On Earth, a failed harvest is a financial catastrophe and a humanitarian crisis that gets resolved by importing food from somewhere that did not fail. the global agricultural system has redundancy built across continents and hemispheres. When one region loses a crop, the supply chain routes around it. On Mars, there is no routing around it. There is no somewhere else. The hydroponic bay is the only farm. The LED arrays are the only sun. The nutrient solution sure is the only soil. If production fails, the crew draws down on whatever emergency reserves were shipped from Earth reserves that are finite, that diminish with every shortfall, and that cannot be replenished until the next supply window opens, which may be more than 2 years away. The crew does not eat from the planet. The crew eats from a machine, in a room, under artificial light, on a carefully managed schedule dictated by growth cycles and resource availability, with no backup supplier and no margin for repeated failure. But even with oxygen manufactured, water recycled, and food grown under controlled conditions, all of it, every gram of food, every liter of water, every breath of manufactured air, depends on a single resource that Mars provides more poorly than almost any other environment humanity has ever considered inhabiting. And that is where the story becomes truly frightening. Every system described in this story runs on electricity. The oxygen generator runs on electricity. The carbon dioxide scrubber runs on electricity. The water recycling system runs on electricity. The hydroponic lighting arrays, the habitat heating, the air circulation fans, the dust filtration units, the communication equipment, the medical diagnostic tools, the airlock mechanisms, the suit charging stations, every single one of them draws from the same power supply, continuously, without pause. Remove the electricity and you do not inconvenience the crew. You begin a countdown, a domino sequence in which each falling system accelerates the collapse of the ones depending on it. And the endpoint of that sequence is not discomfort. It is death. This is the foundational vulnerability that sits beneath every other survival system on Mars. And it begins with a number that most people find surprising. Mars receives approximately 43% of the solar energy per unit area that Earth receives. The reason is simple geometry. Mars orbits the Sun at an average distance of roughly 1.5 times Earth's orbital radius, and solar energy intensity follows an inverse square relationship with distance, less distance, more energy, more distance, less. A solar panel that generates 1 kilowatt of electricity under direct sunlight on Earth produces roughly 430 watts in the same sunlight on Mars, before accounting for any other losses. Before accounting for the Martian day, which runs 24 hours and 37 minutes, meaning solar panels sit dark for roughly half of every cycle, requiring either battery storage sufficient to bridge the night or an alternative power source to carry the load when the sun is down. These two constraints, reduced solar intensity and intermittent availability, would be challenging enough on their own. The third constraint is the one that transforms the power problem from difficult to potentially lethal. Dust storms on Mars are not local weather events. They can grow to encompass the entire planet and persist for weeks or months at a time, filling the atmosphere with suspended particles that block sunlight from reaching the surface. During a major global dust storm, solar panel output can drop by 80% or more, not for an afternoon, for the duration of the storm, which historical data suggests can last from several weeks to several months. The crew cannot wait it out on reduced power the way a household waits out a blackout with flashlights and candles. Reduced power on Mars means reduced oxygen generation, reduced heating in an environment where outside temperatures can plunge to negative 100 degrees Celsius or lower at night, reduced water recycling, reduced food production lighting. Every percentage point of lost solar output is a percentage point of lost life support margin. The 2018 global dust storm on Mars provided a real demonstration of exactly what this means. NASA's Opportunity rover, a machine that had operated on the Martian surface for nearly 15 years, far exceeding its original 90-day mission design, lost contact with Earth when dust accumulation on its solar panels dropped power below the threshold required to operate its systems and survive the cold. Engineers at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory sent recovery commands for months. Opportunity never responded. It was declared lost in February 2019. Opportunity needed no oxygen. It required no heating to survive at human body temperature. It carried no water and grew no food. It had none of the layered biological dependencies that a human crew brings to the same environment. And the dust storm still killed it by cutting off its power. A crew of 4 people facing an equivalent storm would watch oxygen generation slow. Heating systems struggle, water recycling falter, and crop lighting dim all simultaneously, while trapped inside a sealed habitat with no ability to address the root cause until the storm passes and the panels can be cleaned. The power demand that must be met continuously, through nights, through storms, through every equipment failure and seasonal variation, is substantial. Engineering estimates for a 4-person Mars habitat suggest a continuous electrical requirement of roughly 40 to 100 kilowatts, depending on the level of activity and the extent of in situ resource utilization operations underway. For context, the average American home consumes approximately 1.2 kilowatts continuously. A Mars habitat for 4 people would require the sustained electrical output equivalent to between 30 and 80 American homes running simultaneously. The primary consumers are heating, maintaining 20 to 22 degrees Celsius inside, while outside temperatures sit at -60 or lower, along with oxygen generation, carbon dioxide scrubbing, water recycling, agricultural lighting, and communications. Solar arrays can contribute meaningfully when the sky is clear and the sun is up, but they cannot carry the full load through Martian nights and cannot be relied upon during storms. NASA's Kilopower project addressed this gap by developing a compact fission reactor concept, a small nuclear power system capable of producing 1 to 10 kilowatts of continuous electrical output, regardless of dust conditions, darkness, or season. Ground tests of the Kilopower prototype demonstrated the technology functions as designed, and the concept has progressed through multiple development phases. But to reach 40 to 100 kilowatts, you need multiple reactors. Each reactor added to the system contributes additional mass that must survive launch and landing. Additional mechanical complexity requiring its own maintenance and additional radioactive material operating in an environment already saturated with galactic cosmic radiation. Inside a sealed habitat with no evacuation route if something goes wrong. A fission reactor malfunction on Mars does not trigger an emergency response from a nuclear regulatory agency. It triggers whatever response 4 people with finite tools and no external support can mount in a confined space, while simultaneously managing every other system that depends on the power the malfunctioning reactor is no longer producing. The most realistic power architecture for early Mars habitation combines solar arrays with battery storage and 1 or more nuclear units, creating redundancy across different failure modes. When dust dims the solar panels, the nuclear unit carries the base load. When the nuclear unit requires maintenance, solar and battery cover the gap. Redundancy is essential. It is also expensive in the currencies that matter most on Mars: mass shipped from Earth, volume consumed inside or adjacent to the habitat, maintenance hours drawn from a crew whose time is already overwhelmed, and complexity added to systems that complexity always makes more fragile. Every kilowatt of power on Mars must be generated, stored, managed, and protected. None of it arrives for free. None of it can be taken for granted for a single hour. And yet, power, oxygen, water, and food. Suppose you have solved all of them. Suppose every machine is running, every system is balanced, every resource is within acceptable margins. There remains a problem that no engineering solution can fully address, because it lives not in the habitat's walls or its machinery, but in the body of every person inside it, a body that is changing every day, changing in ways that accumulate silently and changing in a direction that may prove impossible to reverse. You do not feel gravity. That is the paradox at the center of this problem. Gravity is so constant, so uniform, so perfectly matched to every biological system you possess, that it registers as nothing at all. You sit in a chair and feel the chair. You stand on the ground and feel the ground. You do not feel the 1G of gravitational force pulling every fluid, every bone cell, every muscle fiber in your body toward Earth's center, the force that your skeleton, your cardiovascular system, your inner ear, and your hormonal regulation have spent millions of years of evolutionary refinement learning to work with. You do not feel it because your body was built around it so completely that the two are indistinguishable. On Mars, that invisible foundation is reduced to 38% of what it is on Earth. Not eliminated, not zero, 38%. Enough gravity that you walk rather than float. Enough that objects fall when you drop them. Enough that daily life feels, in the early days, surprisingly manageable compared to what you might have feared. And that is precisely why it is so dangerous. The damage it does is not dramatic. It is quiet, cumulative, and based on current scientific evidence, potentially irreversible. Begin with bone. The skeleton is not inert structural material. It is living tissue in continuous biological negotiation with the mechanical forces acting on it. Bone-forming cells, called osteoblasts, lay down new mineral matrix in response to mechanical loading the compression and tension signals that gravity and muscle activity produce in bone tissue throughout every waking hour. Remove or reduce those signals, and osteoblast activity decreases. The bone-resorbing cells continue their work. The balance tips toward net loss. A 2022 study examining osteoblast function in simulated partial gravity environments found that bone-forming cell activity was significantly inhibited at 0.38 GE. The finding carried an implication that researchers described as concerning even a moderate reduction in gravitational loading. Not the complete absence of gravity studied aboard the International Space Station, but simply a reduction to Martian levels was sufficient to meaningfully disrupt the cellular mechanism responsible for maintaining skeletal density. Bone is not only structural. The interior of long bones contains marrow, the tissue that produces red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. Significant bone loss degrades this hematopoietic function. Fewer red blood cells means reduced oxygen carrying capacity in the bloodstream. Fewer white blood cells means weakened immune response in an environment where radiation is already challenging cellular repair mechanisms. And confined living conditions accelerate the spread of any pathogen that gains a foothold in the habitat. Bone loss on Mars is not simply a fracture risk. It is a systemic biological degradation that touches immunity and oxygen transport, and the body's fundamental capacity to respond to injury or infection. Muscle follows a parallel trajectory. A 2026 study conducted by researchers at the University of Rhode Island and Harvard Medical School, using an onboard centrifuge aboard the International Space Station to expose mice to varying gravitational levels, found that animals held at 0.33 G close to Martian surface gravity showed reduced muscle atrophy compared to animals in full microgravity, but did not show complete prevention of muscle loss. Complete prevention was observed only at 0.67 G or higher. The implication for long-duration Mars habitation is direct crew members would likely experience progressive muscular weakening over months and years despite daily exercise. With no gravitational environment available to halt the process, the treadmills and resistance machines packed into the habitat's exercise corner would slow the decline. Based on current evidence, they would not stop it. The cardiovascular system faces its own adaptation pressure. On Earth, your heart works continuously against gravity to push blood upward from the lower body toward the brain. This workload shapes cardiac muscle mass and output capacity over a lifetime. At 0.38 G, the heart's anti-gravity workload is substantially reduced. The long-term consequence, well documented in full microgravity aboard the International Space Station, is that the heart gradually decreases in size and pumping strength as it adapts to a lower demand environment. Whether this cardiac remodeling occurs at Martian gravity levels and at what rate has never been measured in any human being. No person has ever lived in partial gravity for more than a few days during the Apollo lunar surface missions. Missions far too brief to reveal the slow cardiovascular adaptations that accumulate over years. Then there is vision. Spaceflight-associated neuroocular syndrome, identified in a significant fraction of long-duration International Space Station crew members, involves elevated intracranial pressure resulting from the headward shift of bodily fluids in the absence of gravity's downward pull. The consequences include flattening of the eyeball, swelling of the optic nerve, and in some cases, permanent changes to visual acuity. At 0.38 Ig, the fluid shift toward the head would be less severe than in full microgravity. Whether it would be absent over years of exposure has never been tested. A crew member experiencing gradual vision loss on Mars has no ophthalmologist to consult, no MRI scanner to image the optic nerve, and no treatment options beyond whatever medications and basic interventions the Habitat's medical kit contains. The deepest uncertainty in all of this is not about individual organ systems. It is about the space between what we know and what we are proposing to do. Every piece of human physiological data collected in altered gravity exists at either 1G or 0G. Decades of International Space Station research have given us a detailed picture of what happens to the human body in weightlessness. We know the rates of bone loss. We know the cardiovascular changes. We know the fluid dynamics. At 0.38 G, the precise environment where Mars settlers would spend years or decades, we have essentially no long-term human data. No mammal has been gestated, born, raised, or aged in partial gravity. The gap in our knowledge is not a minor methodological limitation. It is an enormous void directly in the middle of the most significant physiological question raised by human Mars habitation. We are proposing to send people into that void and learn what happens by watching it happen to them. But if the body is changing in ways that accumulate silently and may prove impossible to reverse what happens to the mind that has no bone density to measure, no muscle mass to track, no imaging study that captures what confinement and deprivation do to it when the weeks become months and the months become years, and the walls of the habitat never once change. There is a test NASA has been running in Houston, Texas, inside a structure about the size of a generous apartment, 1,550 square feet of pressurized space, divided into functional zones, sleeping quarters, a work area, a small greenhouse, a medical station, no windows facing outside, no natural light entering from any direction. The crew inside communicates with the outside world on a simulated delay. They eat shelf-stable food and packaged meals. They conduct maintenance tasks and science experiments on a structured schedule. They exercise daily. They are, by every external measure, functional and productive. They also reported consistently that what they missed most was not their families, not their favorite foods, not privacy or personal space or any of the things you might expect. They missed grass. They missed the color blue in a sky. They missed the feeling of wind on their skin. NASA's CHAPIA program, Crew Health and Performance Exploration Analog, completed its first year-long simulation in July 2024. The second mission is currently underway, and what the program keeps surfacing, behind the physiological data and the performance metrics, is something that sounds almost embarrassingly simple until you understand the neuroscience behind it. The human brain was not built for this, not partially built for it, not poorly optimized for it. Structurally, evolutionarily, chemically, it was built for something else entirely, something that does not exist inside any habitat that could ever be constructed on Mars. The human nervous system evolved across millions of years in open environments, varied light, moving air, the sound of water, of wind, of other living things, smells that shift with season and weather and proximity to soil, horizons that change as you move through them, color gradients in the sky that transition across the day from one state to another, each one a signal the brain reads and uses to calibrate time, mood, arousal, and rest. Every sensory system in the human body was shaped by feedback from a natural world that is rich, complex, unpredictable, and constantly changing. That feedback is not decorative. It is functional. It is how the brain maintains the neurochemical balance that keeps cognition sharp, emotion regulated, and behavior oriented toward meaningful action. Remove those inputs. Put a human being inside a sealed metal structure with artificial lighting on a fixed cycle, recycled air that smells of nothing natural, walls that never change, and a horizon that is always the same wall 10 feet away, and the brain does not simply feel bored. It begins to run low on the raw material it needs to function normally. Decades of environmental psychology research have confirmed what feels intuitively true exposure to natural environments. Even passive exposure through a window measurably reduces cortisol, improves sustained attention, enhances emotional regulation, and speeds recovery from cognitive fatigue. The effect is not subtle. It is large enough to show up consistently across study designs, populations, and measurement methods. Nature is not a luxury the brain enjoys. It is an input the brain requires. On Mars, that input is gone. Not reduced, gone. The underground habitat has no windows because windows are radiation inlets. The artificial lighting has no dynamic quality that replicates what the sky does across a full day because replicating that precisely requires power the habitat cannot spare. The air moves only because fans push it through ducts. Nothing outside the walls is alive. Nothing beyond the airlock is welcoming. And there is no getting away from any of it. Not for an afternoon. Not for a weekend. Not for a single hour of unstructured time in an environment that is not the same four walls. What happens inside the brain under those conditions is documented. In 2010-6, researchers entered a facility in Moscow and did not leave for 520 days, the Mars 500 experiment, designed to simulate the psychological timeline of a full Mars mission, including transit and surface operations. The researchers were not unwell people. They were selected for psychological resilience, adaptability, and performance under stress. They were, by any reasonable standard, extraordinarily well-suited to difficult conditions. The data that emerged anyway was sobering. Circadian rhythms destabilized over time. Physical activity declined progressively, despite structured exercise requirements. Cortisol patterns shifted. Serotonin and dopamine markers changed in ways consistent with low-grade chronic mood disruption. One crew member experienced a prolonged depressive episode that the isolation environment itself made almost impossible to address. Another withdrew progressively from group interactions, spending increasing amounts of time in his private quarters, reducing voluntary social contact to a minimum, 520 days, with a defined endpoint, with knowledge that the outside world was still there, accessible again on a specific future date. A Mars settlement has no endpoint. There is no date circled on a calendar when the habitat door opens and the crew walks back into the world they left behind. The isolation is not a mission phase. It is the condition of existence, indefinitely. And the psychological literature on long-duration confinement is unambiguous about what happens when the time frame extends from bounded to open-ended. Researchers who study polar expeditions, submarine deployments, and remote outpost assignments have identified a pattern so consistent it has its own name, the third quarter phenomenon. At roughly 3/4 of the way through any isolated mission, psychological indicators predictably worsen, motivation drops, interpersonal friction increases, sleep quality degrades, cognitive performance dips. The mechanism appears to be partly anticipatory, knowing that the end is approaching, but not yet arrived, while simultaneously experiencing the accumulated weight of months of confinement triggers a specific kind of demoralization that is distinct from earlier phase adjustment stress on Mars. There is no third quarter. There is no arc that moves toward resolution. The phenomenon has no logical endpoint to anchor around. The weight accumulates without the counterbalancing knowledge that it will lift. What the research calls a temporary trough becomes, in a permanent settlement, simply the ambient condition. The biology underneath this is not mysterious. Sensory monotony suppresses the dopaminergic systems that drive motivation and reward seeking. Social monotony, the same four faces, in the same small space, with no new people ever entering, reduces the novelty inputs that serotonin pathways depend on for baseline regulation. Over months and years, both systems downregulate. The clinical result is a profile that looks indistinguishable from major depressive disorder, motivational flatness, emotional blunting, difficulty concentrating, social withdrawal, disrupted sleep architecture. On Earth, the first-line intervention for depression caused by environmental factors is to change the environment, step outside, move to a different space, introduce novelty. None of those options exist inside a sealed underground structure on a planet with a toxic surface atmosphere. The medications that treat depression chemically require supply from Earth, degrade over time, and eventually run out. The therapy that addresses it cognitively requires a trained therapist, of which the crew has none, and communication delays that make real-time therapeutic conversation with Earth-based clinicians physically impossible. The crew is, in every practical sense, on their own managing their collective mental health, with whatever internal resources they brought with them, and whatever they can build for each other inside four walls that never change. And if one person's mind begins to fracture quietly, the crew cannot simply wait it out, because the crew member experiencing the fracture is also responsible for maintaining the oxygen generator, for monitoring the water recycling system, for conducting the surface excursion tomorrow that no one else is trained to complete alone. The mind is not separate from the life support equation on Mars. It is part of it. You are four people. You are living in a structure approximately the size of a large house. You cannot leave it. You cannot call anyone who can reach you in less than 8 minutes at the absolute best. And that 8 minutes is one way. Any response to anything you say will not arrive for another 8 minutes after that. A conversation that would take 30 seconds on Earth takes a minimum of 16 minutes to complete a single exchange. A troubleshooting session that would last an hour in a conference room with an engineering team takes an entire day of message queues and waiting intervals when conducted across interplanetary distance. This is the communication reality of Mars, not a minor inconvenience to root around. A fundamental structural feature of existence on that planet, built into the physics of the distance by the speed of light itself, not changeable by any technology that exists or is being developed. Signal delay between Earth and Mars ranges from approximately 4 minutes at closest orbital approach to approximately 24 minutes at maximum separation. As both planets move along their respective orbits around the Sun, the average delay across a full mission is somewhere in the range of 12 to 15 minutes each way. During conjunction, the period when Mars passes behind the Sun from Earth's perspective communication is blocked entirely for weeks at a time. The crew goes dark. No messages in. No messages out. Whatever happens during conjunction, the crew handles without any external input, support, or awareness from anyone on Earth. Now consider what that communication structure means for governance, for every decision that has stakes, for every conflict between crew members, for every moment when someone needs to appeal to an authority outside the room. On the International Space Station, Mission Control in Houston or Moscow monitors the crew in near real time. Flight directors can intervene in scheduling decisions, arbitrate interpersonal disputes, override crew judgment on safety-critical matters, and provide guidance on emergencies within seconds of being informed. The crew is never functionally alone. There is always a layer of institutional authority and expertise, one radio call away, ready to help think through whatever is happening and empowered to redirect the situation if needed. On Mars, that layer does not exist. A crew member who has a conflict with another crew member cannot escalate it to Houston and receive a response before the situation has already resolved itself, for better or worse. A commander who must make a decision about power allocation during a dust storm cannot run it by mission control and wait for approval. The decision must be made with the information available in the room, by the people in the room, right now. This sounds straightforward until you consider what kinds of decisions these actually are. Who gets priority access to the medical kit when two people are injured simultaneously? What happens when the water recycling system and the oxygen generator both show warning indicators in the same hour, and there is only enough crew capacity to address one immediately? Who decides which and by what authority? What happens when one crew member becomes convinced that another is psychologically unfit for a critical task, and that assessment is disputed by the person being assessed? What happens when two people stop trusting each other completely, in a space they cannot leave on Earth? These scenarios have resolution structures, legal systems, chains of command, mediation processes, the possibility of physical separation. Someone leaves. On Mars, no one leaves. The door at the end of the corridor does not open onto a street. It opens onto a surface that kills you in 60 seconds without full protective equipment. There is no walking away. There is no cooling off period that involves actual distance. The four walls contain the entire social universe, permanently. History offers the closest analogs we have: Antarctic winter overstations, nuclear submarine deployments, remote research outposts that go months without resupply or evacuation capability. The psychological literature from these environments documents, with uncomfortable consistency, that small groups under prolonged isolation develop what researchers call social drift, a gradual decoupling from the behavioral norms and cultural reference points of the society they came from, accompanied by the emergence of internal group dynamics that outside observers would find difficult to recognize as healthy. Cliques form, grievances calcify. Hierarchies emerge that were never formally authorized. Individuals who held authority in one context find it quietly eroding in another. Trust, once lost in a confined environment, cannot be rebuilt through the normal mechanisms of social repair that depend on physical space and voluntary distance. On Mars, that drift is not temporary. There is no return from which the group resets. The culture that emerges inside the habitat becomes the only culture that exists for those people. Earth recedes, not just in distance, but in psychological reality. The messages that arrive from family members are recorded, transmitted, received with a delay, and played back in a private bunk at the end of a maintenance shift. They are not conversations. They are dispatches from another world. The voices are familiar. The experiences they describe are increasingly foreign. A parent's account of a difficult week at work, a child's description of a school event, a friend's news about a relationship ending. These arrive as artifacts from a reality that the crew member has not inhabited for months or years, and to which they will not return for years more, if ever. Earth does not stay real at that distance. It becomes abstract, a set of memories, a theoretical home. And as Earth becomes abstract, the habitat becomes more real than anything else. The people in it become, by default, everyone. And that weight, the weight of being someone's entire social world, in a room you share with no exit, is a pressure that no selection process and no training protocol has ever been demonstrated to fully prepare human beings for at the timescales a Mars settlement requires. There are no laws on Mars, because no jurisdiction extends there with any enforcement mechanism. There is no court. There is no police. There is no structure of governance that anyone aboard has not personally agreed to, and no external power capable of compelling compliance with any of it if someone decides not to comply. The crew is the government, the judiciary, and the enforcement mechanism simultaneously, four people deciding what the rules are, whether they are being followed, and what happens if they are not, while also being the subjects of all three. It is the smallest, most isolated, most consequential experiment in self-governance that any group of human beings has ever attempted. And it runs not for a semester or a year or even a presidential term. It runs for as long as anyone on Mars is still alive. There is a particular kind of fear that most Americans over 50 have learned to manage quietly. It is not the fear of death itself. Most people make a kind of peace with that over time. It is the fear of what happens between the first symptom and the last breath. The fear of being sick somewhere. Help cannot reach you fast enough. It is why people move closer to cities as they age. Why they choose neighborhoods near good hospitals. Why they keep insurance cards current and specialist phone numbers saved in their contacts. The entire architecture of American healthcare. The urgent care centers. The 24-hour pharmacies. The trauma bays. The specialist networks reachable by a single referral exists to compress the distance between the moment something goes wrong and the moment a trained person with the right tools intervenes. On Mars, that distance is not compressed. It is absolute. The closest emergency room is 140 million miles away on average. The closest specialist of any kind, cardiologist, oncologist, orthopedic surgeon, neurologist, is separated from the patient not by traffic or waiting list, but by the physics of orbital mechanics. A medical evacuation is not a matter of calling a helicopter. It is a matter of waiting for two planets to align in their orbits around the sun. A window that opens approximately every 26 months, and then surviving a return journey that takes 6 to 9 months under the best conditions. A crew member who develops a serious medical emergency between launch windows is not waiting for a better option to become available. There is no better option. The habitat is the hospital. The habitat's medical kit is the pharmacy. The one crew member with the most medical training is the entire healthcare system. That medical kit is finite in ways that matter enormously. A well-equipped Mars habitat might carry a portable ultrasound unit genuinely useful for imaging soft tissue and identifying internal injuries or organ abnormalities without radiation. It would carry a surgical instrument set capable of basic procedures, an anesthesia capability of some kind, likely a combination of local anesthetics and sedatives with a limited supply, a defibrillator, a ventilator, a limited formulary of medications covering the most statistically likely conditions: antibiotics, anticoagulants, pain management, psychiatric medications, cardiovascular drugs. No blood bank, no MRI, no CT scanner, no pathology laboratory capable of running the tests that distinguish one diagnosis from another when symptoms overlap. No surgical theater with a scrub team, a circulating nurse, an anesthesiologist, and a recovery room. One person performing every role simultaneously, with whatever equipment survived the journey from Earth and has not yet degraded past usefulness. Now consider what that means in specific, concrete situations. Appendicitis is the most discussed example because it is common, age agnostic, and illustrates the problem with uncomfortable clarity. Caught early. Uncomplicated appendicitis can be treated successfully with antibiotics alone, a protocol tested aboard the International Space Station and validated as a viable non-surgical option when surgical capability is unavailable. If the condition is identified quickly, if the right antibiotics are in inventory, if the patient responds as expected, this is survivable without an operating room. But if the appendix perforates before the diagnosis is made, because the crew member dismissed early symptoms as stress-related discomfort, because the portable ultrasound reading was ambiguous, because the early signs overlapped with something else entirely, the situation changes completely. A perforated appendix requires emergency surgery. The person performing that surgery on Mars may be a physician who has not performed an emergency abdominal procedure in years, operating with limited anesthesia in a makeshift surgical environment, with no one to assist except crew members whose hands may be shaking, for reasons that have nothing to do with incompetence. A complex fracture of femur, broken in a fall during a pressurized suit excursion, for example, gets set and immobilized and monitored. There is no imaging capable of confirming whether the reduction is anatomically correct. Healing is watched by eye and by symptom. In 38% gravity, bone healing proceeds differently than on Earth, and the data on how differently is essentially non-existent because no human being has ever healed a broken bone in that gravitational environment. The crew waits, the patient waits, and whatever is happening inside the immobilized limb remains invisible until it either resolves or it does not. Cancer sits at the far end of this problem. The radiation environment on Mars, 240 to 300 millisieverts per year from galactic cosmic rays alone, raises cancer risk steadily and cumulatively with every year of surface exposure. This is not a hypothetical risk that might manifest in a small percentage of an unlucky population. It is a biological consequence of chronic high-energy particle bombardment of DNA, confirmed by decades of radiobiological research. Among a Mars crew living for years on the surface, cancer is not a worst-case scenario. It is a statistical expectation, and if it develops, the treatment options inside the habitat are whatever chemotherapy agents were included in the medical formulary, a finite supply that cannot be replenished until the next cargo mission, which may arrive after the window for effective early intervention, has already closed. Radiation therapy requires equipment that no early Mars mission will carry. Surgical oncology requires imaging, pathology, and post-operative support that the habitat cannot provide. Detection depends on whatever screening the crew physician can perform with portable equipment and clinical judgment. Looking for a disease that, in its early and most treatable stages, is often completely asymptomatic. Every crew member on Mars lives inside this knowledge, not abstractly, concretely. They wake up each morning aware that a kidney stone, a cardiac arrhythmia, a sudden neurological event, a gallbladder attack conditions that American emergency rooms resolve routinely in a matter of hours could become the event that defines how their story ends. Not because medicine has failed, because distance has made medicine irrelevant at the scale where it most matters. The psychological weight of this awareness does not stay contained to the moments when someone is actually sick. It permeates every day. It changes how people interpret physical sensations. A headache that anyone in an American suburb would ignore carries a different freight on Mars, where intracranial pressure changes are a documented consequence of altered gravity and a potential early sign of serious neurological change. A persistent cough in a habitat where Martian dust infiltration is ongoing is not something to dismiss. Fatigue in an environment of chronic radiation exposure and sleep disruption and psychological stress is a symptom that could mean almost anything. And the absence of diagnostic tools to narrow the differential means it often means nothing actionable, which is its own particular kind of torment. The crew physician carries a burden that no medical training fully prepares a person for. They are responsible for the health of people they live with, eat with, depend on for their own survival. They are the only medical resource those people have. They know the inventory of medications better than anyone else in the habitat, which means they also know when the supply of something critical is running low and what running out means. And there is nothing they can do about it except ration carefully and hope the next resupply arrives before the need becomes acute. And all of it, the radiation accumulating in tissue, the dust lodging permanently in lung cells, the oxygen manufactured breath by breath, the water recycled from the bodies of the crew, the food grown under artificial light in decontaminated soil, the power generated by machines that must never fail, the bones quietly thinning, the minds quietly straining, the medical kit slowly emptying all of it, depends on one thing that never stops, never rests, and cannot be delegated to anyone outside the walls. And all of that, the radiation, the dust, the oxygen, the water, the food, the gravity, the psychology, the medicine depends on one thing that must never fail, a maintenance system run by the same exhausted people keeping everything else alive, with replacement parts 225 million kilometers away, impossible to order, impossible to deliver quickly, impossible to wait until morning for. Ask someone what they imagine a Mars astronaut's day looks like, and the picture that comes back is usually some version of the same scene: a scientist in a spacesuit, standing on rust-colored ground, collecting rock samples or deploying instruments, or staring thoughtfully at a distant ridge while a camera captures the moment for history. It is the image that mission promotional materials have cultivated deliberately, because it is the image that inspires the explorer, the discoverer, the human being at the frontier of what our species has ever reached. That image is not false. It is incomplete in a way that changes everything about what living on Mars actually means day to day. Aboard the International Space Station, researchers who have studied crew time allocation found that maintenance and housekeeping tasks consistently consume between 40 and 50% of total working hours, not 40 to 50% of the unimportant hours. 40 to 50% of all hours, including the hours nominally scheduled for science, for exercise, for communication with Earth, and the International Space Station operates with every advantage that Mars will not have. Mission Control in Houston monitors every system in near real time. Replacement parts arrive on resupply missions at regular intervals. If a pump fails, an engineer on the ground who helped design that pump is available to talk through the repair procedure in real time, looking at the same telemetry data the crew is seeing, guiding every step. The support infrastructure surrounding the International Space Station is enormous, invisible from the outside, and absolutely central to the crew's ability to function. On Mars, that infrastructure does not exist. The crew is the maintenance team, the engineering department, the spare parts inventory manager, the diagnostic technician, and the repair crew simultaneously for every system in the habitat, every piece of equipment on the surface, every component of every machine that keeps them alive. And the environment they are maintaining in is substantially more hostile than low Earth orbit in every relevant dimension. Martian dust works its way into mechanical joints, degrades seals, and abrades moving parts with every pressurization cycle, every airlock operation, every suit donned and doffed. Temperature swings between the warmth inside the habitat and the negative 60 degrees Celsius or colder outside stress every material that spans that boundary. Metal fatigues. Polymers become brittle. Adhesives degrade. Radiation damages electronic components over time in ways that are cumulative and not always immediately visible as failure. Instead, manifesting as subtle errors that become critical errors that become catastrophic failures if not caught in between. A normal morning on Mars, before the scientific work begins, looks nothing like the promotional image. Oxygen concentration check, carbon dioxide level check, airlock pressure integrity check, solar panel output and battery charge, state check, water recycling system flow rate and filter status check, and flag the membrane replacement that is approaching its service interval, hydroponic bay temperature, pH, and nutrient solution concentration check, and note the slight pH drift that needs to be corrected before the next irrigation cycle. Accumulated radiation dose for the week logged. Total suit integrity for today's planned excursion inspected. Seal by seal. Connection by connection. Because a missed crack in a glove seal is not a maintenance oversight. It is a death sentence delivered in 60 seconds. All of this before breakfast. And this is the normal morning. The morning when nothing has gone wrong overnight. The maintenance burden does not distribute itself evenly or predictably. Equipment does not fail on a schedule. A water pump does not signal in advance that it will stop working next Tuesday. A solar panel junction does not announce its impending failure 3 weeks out, so the crew can order a replacement. Failures arrive without warning, at whatever time is least convenient, compounding whatever else is already demanding attention. A carbon dioxide scrubber malfunction during a planned surface excursion means someone stays inside instead of going out, which means the science scheduled for that excursion does not happen, which means the scientific justification for the mission, the work the crew came to Mars to do, gets pushed back again. Science on Mars is what happens in the margins of maintenance, not the other way around. The spare parts problem deserves its own moment of clarity. On Earth, supply chains are so deeply woven into daily life that their existence is invisible. A part fails. A replacement is ordered. It arrives. The gap between failure and repair is measured in days at most, usually hours. On Mars, the gap between failure and repair is measured against a cargo manifest that was finalized on Earth more than a year before the supply ship launched, crossed interplanetary space over 7 to 9 months, and arrived carrying exactly what was packed, not what turned out to be needed in the intervening time. The crew cannot order the part that broke yesterday. They can request it for the next resupply window, which will not open for approximately 26 months, and the part they requested will arrive 6 to 9 months after that. The part that failed today will be replaced, if everything goes well, in 3 years. In the interval, the crew improvises. A 3-dimensional printer loaded with raw polymer feedstock can fabricate replacement components for simple mechanical parts brackets, housings, non-structural fittings. This is genuinely useful. It is also limited to what the printer can produce from available materials, which excludes electronic components, precision machined metal parts, membrane materials for filtration systems, and anything that requires specifications tighter than the printer's resolution can achieve. A failed circuit board cannot be printed. A degraded water filtration membrane cannot be printed. A cracked pressure vessel fitting in a life-critical system cannot be printed with sufficient confidence to stake lives on the result. What cannot be fabricated must be repaired. What cannot be repaired must be worked around. What cannot be worked around becomes a gap in the system, a small one at first, a larger one over time, a potentially fatal one if it touches something that the survival chain depends on. Every unresolved maintenance issue is a debt accumulating interest. The habitat that was launched as a complete, functional, carefully engineered system begins to diverge from its original specifications the moment it lands, and the divergence only grows. Managing that divergence, slowing it, compensating for it, staying ahead of it is the actual occupation of every person on Mars, regardless of what title they hold or what scientific mission they came to accomplish. And there is a final layer to the maintenance problem that numbers and schedules cannot fully capture. The people doing the maintenance are tired, not the tired that a good night's sleep addresses. The tired that accumulates across months of broken circadian rhythms, chronic low-level anxiety, physical exertion in 38% gravity, nutritional constraints that make full caloric and micronutrient replenishment difficult, and the psychological weight of knowing that every task done imperfectly has consequences that no one outside the habitat can fix for them. Tired people miss things. Tired people make errors in judgment that rested people would not make. Tired people cut corners not from laziness, but from the simple arithmetic of too many demands on too little cognitive reserve. And the Mars maintenance environment has no tolerance for the errors that fatigue introduces, because every system being maintained is load-bearing in a structure where every load is a life. After all of that, after surviving each maintenance day, each underground evening, each year away from Earth, the body may have changed so profoundly that the journey home is no longer a safe choice, and Mars has transformed from a destination into the only destination left. There is a moment in every long journey when the traveler stops calculating how far they have come and starts calculating whether going back is still possible, not whether they want to go back, whether they can, whether the body that left is still the body that could survive the return. For most journeys in human history, that question has been logistical. Enough fuel, enough food, enough time before the weather turns. On Mars, the question is biological, and the answer, after enough years, may be that the body which departed Earth no longer exists in a form that Earth can receive. This is the part of the Mars conversation that almost no one wants to have directly. It is easier to talk about rocket trajectories and habitat designs and food production systems problems that yield, at least in principle, to engineering solutions. Biology is less cooperative. Biology has its own timeline, its own thresholds, its own points past which the changes it has made become permanent. And the human body, adapted over millions of years to one specific gravitational environment on one specific planet, does not negotiate those thresholds based on what the mission plan requires. After years at 38% of Earth's gravity, the body is not the same body that arrived. The bones have lost density at a rate that exercise slows, but does not stop. Based on every physiological model currently available, the muscles have weakened in proportion to the reduced mechanical demand placed on them every waking hour. The heart has remodeled smaller, less forceful, calibrated over months and years to the lower workload that 38% gravity requires of the cardiovascular system. The circulatory architecture that moves blood from the lower body upward against gravitational pull has recalibrated its pressures, its vessel tone, its fluid distribution for a world where gravity pulls at less than half the force it once did. These are not temporary adaptations that reverse quickly when conditions change. They are structural biological changes that took years to develop and would take years to undo if they can be undone at all. Now consider what returning to Earth actually means for a body in that condition. The spacecraft that carries the crew home must decelerate from interplanetary velocity, enter Earth's atmosphere, and land. The forces involved in atmospheric entry and landing, even in a well-designed re-entry vehicle, subject the occupants to acceleration loads that a fully healthy Earth-conditioned body handles without injury. Bones that have thinned over 3 or 5 or 10 years at 38% gravity are not fully healthy Earth-conditioned bones. They are lighter, more porous, more brittle structures that have been adapting to a lower load environment for years. The acceleration loads of re-entry may be sufficient to fracture them. This is not a speculative concern inserted for dramatic effect. It is a straightforward biomechanical consequence of what chronic low-gravity exposure does to skeletal density combined with what re-entry physics imposes on the body. Assume the landing is survived intact. The crew member stands up inside the vehicle. Earth's gravity, 1 full G, 2.6 times the gravitational force their body has experienced for years, pulls on every structure simultaneously. The cardiovascular system, which has recalibrated to sustain adequate cerebral blood flow against a much weaker gravitational gradient, is suddenly asked to perform at a level it has not been conditioning for. The result is orthostatic intolerance blood pools in the lower extremities, cerebral perfusion pressure drops, and the person loses consciousness before they have taken their first step on the planet they came home to. This phenomenon is well documented in International Space Station crew members returning from 6-month missions in zero gravity, who routinely require assistance to stand and cannot walk unassisted for days or weeks after landing. After years at 38% gravity, not zero, but insufficient, the degree of cardiovascular deconditioning is unknown because no human being has ever experienced it. The International Space Station data gives a lower bound. The actual outcome could be worse. Walking, if it becomes possible, carries its own risk. Stress fractures, the hairline breaks that occur when bone is loaded beyond its current structural capacity, are a documented consequence of returning Earth-conditioned bone to high-load environments too quickly. For bone that has been in a low-load environment for years, the threshold at which ordinary walking produces stress fracture loads may be dramatically lower than for a healthy Earth-based individual. The act of carrying one's own weight across a floor could, in a body sufficiently deconditioned by years of Martian gravity, cause the kind of injuries that require surgical intervention and months of recovery on a planet that the crew member just traveled 6 to 9 months to reach. At some point along this trajectory, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, the exact threshold unknown because the data does not exist, the biological cost of returning to Earth may exceed the biological cost of remaining on Mars. The body becomes, in a clinical sense, a Martian body, not metaphorically, physiologically. The gravity it is calibrated for, the cardiovascular pressures it maintains, The skeletal density it has settled into all of it, oriented to a world that is not Earth. Going home becomes not a journey but a medical procedure, a dangerous one that might not succeed. And then there are the children. If Mars settlement extends across decades, children will be born there. This is not a distant hypothetical. It is the logical consequence of any long-term human presence on the planet. And the question of what growing up at 38% gravity does to a developing human body is one that science can't currently answer because no data exists. No mammal has been gestated, born and raised in partial gravity. The developmental biology of the human skeleton, the nervous system, the cardiovascular system, and the vestibular system under those conditions is entirely uncharacterized. The bones of a child growing in 38% gravity would develop in response to 38% gravity, building density, and structural geometry calibrated to that load, not to Earth's. The cardiovascular system would develop its pressure architecture for that world. The neuromuscular pathways that govern balance, coordination, and proprioception would wire themselves to the sensory inputs of a 38% gravity environment. A child raised entirely on Mars might be physically incapable of surviving on Earth, not unwilling, not unprepared in any correctable sense, biologically incompatible with the planet their parents came from, in ways that no rehabilitation program could fully address, because the developmental windows in which those systems were forming have already closed. They would be Martians, not by choice, not by identity, by the irreversible biology of where their bones grew and where their hearts learned to pump and where their nervous systems calibrated themselves to the pull of gravity during the years when those calibrations became permanent. No one asked their permission. No ethics board reviewed the study design. No informed consent process preceded the experiment. On Earth, a research protocol that exposed developing human children to conditions known to produce permanent physiological changes incompatible with their species' native environment would not survive the first institutional review. The consent requirements alone would make it impossible. On Mars, it happens as the natural consequence of people living there and having children, because that is what people do, and no one will be in a position to stop it. Once the settlement is established, and the departure windows are years apart, and the biology is already underway, this is where the story leads. Not to a disaster with a villain, not to a triumph with a hero, to a question sitting quietly at the intersection of science, medicine, and ethics, a question that has no answer yet, that the institutions responsible for thinking about such things have not yet formally engaged, and that will become urgent and irreversible on a timeline determined not by committee deliberation, but by the pace of rocket development and the ambitions of people who are already building the vehicles. The science does not know what happens to a human body after a decade on Mars. It does not know what happens to a child born there. It does not know where the threshold of no return sits, or whether it can be moved by interventions not yet developed, or whether some people will cross it before anyone realizes the crossing has occurred. What the science knows is that the question is real, that the biology is unforgiving, that the universe does not grant exceptions to its rules based on how much we want the answer to be different, and Mars will wait, as it has always waited 4 billion years old, silent, rust-red, and entirely indifferent for us to figure out what we are actually asking before we commit to the answer. We have traveled a long way in this story, from the moment unprotected skin meets a Martian atmosphere that boils its own fluids, through invisible radiation carving corridors of damage, through DNA, through dust that lodges permanently in lung tissue and never leaves, through oxygen manufactured breath by breath, water recycled from the bodies of the crew, food grown under artificial light in chemically hostile ground, power that a single dust storm can reduce to almost nothing, through bones quietly thinning in 38% gravity, through minds straining against walls that never change, through a community of 4 people who are simultaneously each other's only doctors, only judges, only friends, and only escape, through maintenance logs that never end and medical kits that slowly empty, And finally, to a child born on another world whose body may never be compatible with the one her parents left behind. We do not know what happens at the far end of all of this. That is not a failure of science. It is the location of science's actual frontier, the honest edge where data runs out and the unknown begins. Mars is still out there, silent, red, 4 billion years old and completely indifferent to everything we have just said about it. It does not welcome us. It does not refuse us. It simply exists, exactly as it has always existed, waiting with the particular patience of something that has never needed anything from anyone. And perhaps that is the deepest reason we cannot stop looking at it. Not despite the danger. Because of it. Go if you go, but go with open eyes, full knowledge, and the humility of knowing how much we still do not understand.